communities and about the problem of addiction in Aboriginal communities. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a lot about the history, because that's what I'm most familiar with, as to the background and why we have so much prevalence of addiction in Aboriginal populations. And we're going to go through, it's an amazing story if anybody's ever looked at this. If you look at the areas that have been colonized, such as, I've looked at British Columbia, Hawaii, Tahiti, Australia, and I've just been researching Alaska. And the story is basically the same in all the places where what happened, whether it was in 1700, 1800, and right now in the 20th century, is that people go in and all they're interested in is the resources, and they don't care what happens to the people. Now, a lot of people think that this happened a long time ago. It isn't affecting anything now, but it is affecting. I'm just going to stop and tell you about New Guinea, because in 1938, the continent of New Guinea has two sides. One is Papua New Guinea, which was under Australia until 1975. And it was given independence, much too quickly actually, so that they weren't prepared for it, and they do have problems. But the other side is called, it's called Irian Jaya is one name, West Papua is what the Papuans call it that live there. But a terrible thing happened to it in 1962. It was colonized by the Dutch. But in 1962, it was given to Indonesia as a pawn. To keep Indonesia from going communist. So essentially the United States handed New Guinea to Indonesia. Indonesia has seen it as a source of great wealth. It's the Freeport-McMoRan gold mine, which is the largest gold mine in the world. And there are also oil under the, one of the indigenous groups areas, and it has a lot of minerals as well. So since 1962, the resources have been extracted, but the people, whenever they try to do anything about their lands being removed or anything else, have been slaughtered. So with bows and arrows, they have been resisting AK-47s and torture and flaming villages. So the only reason I'm talking about this, it's just like East Timor. At some point, anytime there's an independence movement, they just move in and they don't even allow journalists to witness what's going on in those countries. So this situation is not something that is related to the past. And it really does upset me, because I think that we've never learned anything from history since 1600 when we went into South America, of course, and we had the loss of the Mayans and the rest of the native populations in South America. So we'll move on, except the mouse isn't moving here. Let's try it. We'll try it that way. Mm-hmm. Do it at the computer? Aim it at the computer. Sorry about being technologically challenged. It happens to me a lot.
See, there's, your pickup is right there, so aim it at that.
Aim it at that?
Yeah. It should do it.
No, it's not moving. Move it.
Not just the space bar. There, you
Space bar.
there.
No? Next. How do I get it to move to the next slide? Oh, it's there. Yeah, it moved. Okay. Just to exhibit this, I'm just briefly going to run through a little bit of Alaska history, because people do not realize the extent to which indigenous populations were exploited and are being exploited. In 1795, Russia went over to Alaska, and the coastal areas of Alaska were occupied by what are called the Aleutians, and they were a 10,000-year-old civilization that went out in these kayaks, and they hunted seals, and they had quite a complex civilization. But unfortunately, the sea otter had become very, very valuable in China as a result, actually, of Captain Vancouver introducing the sea otter. So they came over with gunboats, and what they did, they took the Aleutian men kidnapped them, held their wives and prisoners as hostages, and forced them to hunt the seals for them. It was very, very brutal. There was one incident where they just lined the Aleutian men up and fired a pistol to see how far the bullet would go. Mm-hmm. Then Russia did put a few forts around, and it had its main location in Sitka, Alaska. But it was too far from Russia to supply properly. So that's why it was sold to the US for $72 million in 1872, because the Russians couldn't get the supplies through to keep them going. So they decided it was kind of a hopeless venture, sold it to the United States. Then they sort of neglected the indigenous populations, and nothing much happened in Alaska until the gold rush in 1900. In 1900, of course, all these people, they called them people from the lower 48, came up from the United States. And they built very nice homes for the people that came up in places like Juneau, because there was a lot of money being invested into the gold fields. This is the story of Alaska, where the money comes in, the offshore speculation, people that don't live there. And this went on in various areas of Alaska, the gold rush, but it was only until 1970 that something positive, really positive, happened in Alaska, and it happened because of the Prudhoe oil fields. So in 1970, they discovered all this oil, and they wanted to get at it, but the indigenous title came up in the courts. And they knew that in order to go in and get this oil, they were going to have to do something about the indigenous title. So what they did, they made a settlement, and they gave 44 million acres and $1 billion, and created 13 native corporations. And they succeeded. Nobody thought they were going to succeed. They had to become capitalists, and a lot of them had to become educated fast. But this is the one positive thing I've seen. Once they were given control over all those resources, they are now, the native corporations are now the driving economic force in Alaska. They started to do something about high schools. Before that time, when you wanted to go to grade 8, you had to go to a boarding school in Alaska near Anchorage. When that was full, they would send Native Alaskan kids to Colorado and Oklahoma at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So you can imagine what a culture clash they had going off to go to grade 8. So this, since that claim settlement, the graduation rate in the high schools has tripled. They're actually getting through. A lot of the CEOs have MBAs now from Colorado, and they're actually Native Alaskans. And the self-worth of Native Alaskans went up tremendously. So that's the one success story that I'm familiar with. Here we go again. Right here. Okay. So it went backwards. I'd like to get to BC. If I can. Sorry about this.
No, let's do this, and let's forget that.
Okay.
So show me which slide you'd like to be at here. There's Alaska, there's British Columbia.
British Columbia would be great.
Okay. And instead of using that clicker.
Click it? No, that's it. It's there.
Yeah, just a second. Just press the space bar.
Just press the space bar. Thank you. We've solved the technological problems, I think. Now, British Columbia, up till 1860, the actual indigenous people here were rather enriched by the fur trade, and they were making a lot of money trading the furs, and actually their culture was quite enriched, so they were having wealthier and wealthier potlatches, and a lot of the art and culture was enriched. But in 1860, the decision was made in England to settle British Columbia. So once the settlers came, this is all done, by the way, with gunboats, so that if you had any resistance here, they would just bring a gunboat into the harbor. And of course, there was a lot of land speculation here, so they were moving First Nations people out of all the harbors. Now, the greatest example of this, and you may have heard of this, is Metlakatla, which is Fort Simpson. And originally, the population up there was Christianized by a man named Duncan, a missionary named Duncan, and they had done a lot to westernize. They had, for instance, a band playing Onward Christian Soldiers. They had Victorian wooden houses. They had walkways. They had a cannery. The government would not give them title to the land under their houses because all this land was being speculated on in England. So they wanted that land. It was a port. Of course, this happened in Vancouver and Victoria and anywhere where the land was valuable. The natives were just moved out. They also had a tremendous death from the Western diseases had already occurred as well. What happened in Metlakatla is the people moved to Alaska. And oddly enough, the American government, which wasn't very kind to its Native Indian people, gave them squatters' rights on Annette Island, and they relocated. But that was how hopeless the situation was at that time for people to get land that they'd been living on and settling for many, many years. Then came, essentially they were marginalized, the survivors. They were moved all over the place. The worst thing that happened was the residential schools, and that was a policy of assimilation, but they never wanted to put any money into it. But the whole purpose of that policy was to take the native out of the native and to try and make them white. Unfortunately, they never put much money into it, so they turned it over to the churches, which again were operating with very little funds. So what they did was they had to hire people, you know, and I guess it was a perfect place to hire people that then started to go into sexual perversion and things like that, because we had an awful history here. They're now doing a lot of settlements out of sexual abuse in these residential schools. Another thing they did too is they'd move them all over the place. Like they'd take the natives from the north and put them down to residential schools in the south. And I think it was to disrupt I don't know if they were trying to disrupt those cultures. I think it was deliberate. So as a result, you had children who would be in residential schools a long ways away from their parents. They were there for most of the year. Sometimes they were there for years at a time. When they got back to their own areas, they were not allowed to speak their native languages in those schools. So when they went home, they couldn't speak their native languages. Their parents had gotten depressed when their children were taken away from them, and a lot of them did start using alcohol at that point in British Columbia. There has been in this province no recognition of Native rights up until recently, and what happened actually was in 1763, King George ordered any further Western exploration that they had to extinguish Aboriginal title. But in British Columbia, they only did 3 little treaties under Douglas on Vancouver Island, and then Britain ordered them to stop making those treaties because they didn't have the money, they didn't want to pay for them. So that's left British Columbia now without treaties except for the Nisga'a Treaty, which has just been negotiated. And I think right now, because they're after the oil and gas on the Queen Charlottes, just as they were after the oil and gas in Prudhoe Bay, there's going to be some settlements almost immediately in North Vancouver, West Vancouver, and Tahiti. And those will be very lucrative deals because that's developed land, so it's worth a lot of money. And just recently, about 2 weeks ago, the Native groups in British Columbia were given control of their education, which again is part of this launch, I think, to get at that gas and oil in the Queen Charlottes, where they know the Haida people have excellent legal challenge because they've been occupying that place for 10,000 years. So that's what's happening, which is good. Now let me see if I can get to another one. Okay, here's Hawaii, and we have a very interesting thing happened in Hawaii. Captain Cook came in 1795. By 1840, the population was down from 1 million to about 40,000 because of syphilis and various Western transmitted diseases. But we had an unfortunate group of missionaries that came up from Boston, Calvinist missionaries, and they quickly gained control of the king, and a number of things happened. One being that in 1850, his advisors had the king turn the land into private ownership, into private property. And of course, the Hawaiians had no money or no understanding of private property. So the land was very quickly picked up by descendants of the missionaries. Missionaries themselves and other foreigners was turned into massive sugar plantations, and they imported 400,000 people from all over the world, Portugal, and to work these plantations because the Hawaiians had already, their birth rate was way down. They had died, a lot of them. And, you know, the state, and then they weren't satisfied with that, but in 1893 they decided Queen Liliuokalani was about to do a new constitution that would give her some of the power back to govern for the sake of Hawaiians. So the sugar planters, who were mainly Americans, formed a rifle company, and when the Queen, which could have stopped the overthrow very quickly, they allowed, the American minister allowed the Marines to come off the USS Boston and stand in between the Queen and the people who were taking over her government. So essentially it was an American illegal occupation of Hawaii. And then in 1898, when they had gone into the Spanish-American War, they outright annexed Hawaii, despite the fact that 50,000 Hawaiians, which were about all the Hawaiians that were left, did a great big petition saying, no, we do not want annexation. And the funny thing is that Hawaiians don't even have the same rights as Native Americans. They have essentially no rights in their own country. They have they have very little upward mobility because most of the people who have money in Hawaii send their children to private schools, so that the public schools have not been funded very well, and therefore you haven't got very many Hawaiians in top positions in Hawaii. Now, what is this transmission, this from generation to generation? What actually is it? Now, you can imagine the narrative that goes on in Hawaiian populations or in Native populations here or Native populations in America, where they've had this history of being marginalized, of having everything essentially taken away from them, their land. Many groups of them have been moved across from where they originally were to somewhere else. They've had many, many deaths. So you have this, naturally you have people self-medicating. I can see why it would be funny if they didn't self-medicate after what they've all gone through. Australia too, I haven't even gone into Australia. I'll probably get to that in a minute. So then you have an awful identity achievement confusion. You can imagine, for instance, in Hawaii, where there's very few full-blooded Hawaiians. There's only about 3,000 of them left. But the people there that have some Hawaiian in them, they're also very often Filipino or Portuguese or Japanese or Chinese or even some Norwegians and Germans that have all come to work these sugar plantations. So you've got this identity achievement task, Erickson's identity achievement task. Who am I going to be? Am I going to be Hawaiian? Am I going to be Japanese? Am I going to be American? So there's quite a bit of confusion with the identity achievement task. In our groups up here too, when you got all these children taken off to residential schools, you didn't get then parenting skills in the next generation because they had been attending residential schools that had really very, very severe rules. Boys couldn't mix with the girls, you couldn't speak your own language, you were punished rather severely if you broke any of these rules. So you really didn't have parenting skills. So then the next generation really didn't know how to parent their children, and they've had this carried on from generation to generation. The residential schools in BC just closed down. Some of them were as late as 1980. So you've had generations of people who have had this narrative about the white people taking their land, taking everything. You've had dysfunction in families. So what happens when you have addiction in the family, of course, is you get a behavior constellation, usually around the addict, that maintains, and it's dysfunctional. It's things like fear or anger being maintained, being used as weapons in order to get a hold of the drug of your choice. And you get this dysfunction being carried on through generations. Because we have, I'd like to go into ethnocentric monoculturalism because there's a difference between outright racism and ethnocentric monoculturalism. Everybody knows what racism is, and nobody ever thinks that they're a racist. But ethnocentric monoculturalism is essentially a pride in your own culture that's been put into you when you were growing up. So we have a lot of people that are basically well-meaning, but they really do think that their own culture is superior and that all other cultures are not, that they're somehow of lesser value. And this may not even be a conscious thing, it may be an unconscious thing. But as a result, when people are hiring, there's a tendency to hire people just like themselves. Or when you're getting boards of directors, there's a tendency to want people just like yourself on boards of directors and this type of thing. So what happens is you get minority groups being discriminated against and marginalized, and they have very little upward mobility. And this has been the case on Indian reservations. A lot of them are located, way off somewhere anyway. When they come into the cities, you get this discrimination. And what happens in Vancouver, for instance, they come in from the reserves very often. There's nowhere for them to live, or they wind up in Skid Row, and then they start getting preyed upon by people. And again, you have all these problems then with people, again, turning to addiction because of all the pain that they've gone through. And of course, you have poverty. Now, what are we to do about this? And I really want to offer a few opinions about this, and perhaps you can join me. The problem that I have is, when you do these kind of talks, you're supposed to be funny. So I was on an Alaska cruise just recently in May, and there was an Afro-American fellow from Chicago. And he managed to get his point across while being extremely funny. And what he said was, we black people don't take many cruises because 200 years ago we took a cruise and look what happened to us, So I think we could say the same thing here, except that I'm not Native Indian, so you'll have to forgive me for saying this, but we could say something like, in 1860, we invited these people over, for a visit, and they stayed and they took our land, and somehow we've never been the same since, or something along that line. But now, if we look at Viktor Frankl, we say, well, what on earth is the meaning of all this suffering? So I was doing this last year. I actually made a video in Hawaii, and the person who was interviewing me kept coming back to this. This is such a negative story, what are we going to do about this? And finally, we came up with some ideas that for the descendants of the people who were colonized, of the native groups, that they are a tremendous example of resilience of the human spirit. And although they have poverty and dysfunction and all kinds of problems in their own communities, a lot of them managed to connect with their own spirituality, some of them, and with other things. And they are tremendous role models. I was talking particularly about the Chief's Children's School in Hawaii, where they took the children who would become the kings and queens of Hawaii, and they put them in this residential school, essentially. Just the children that eventually became the kings and queens of Hawaii. And they had this severe hell and brimstone missionary who just felt that their whole culture was pagan, and he told them so. He would use severe punishment like whipping. There's one incident in his journal where he reports whipping Lot, who became Kamehameha V, 20 times, and Alexander, who became Kamehameha IV, he whipped him 12 times. And they had very severe punishments, but they had flaws in that school. They had boys and girls, and in the Hawaiian tradition, those boys and girls of the ruling class would get together before marriage. And they did in that school, and they didn't do very much about it, except they thought that shaming them and punishing them would work. But it didn't work, and they continued to do that. And what I think happened with the oldest boy, who was about 16 when he went in there, his core beliefs had been established, and he fought back, and he had spirit. And he kept fighting despite the fact that he was being whipped and he was being punished, and the parents were giving these black marks every time they did something wrong, so he had the parents on his side right from the very beginning. Some of these children were only 6 years old and 4 years old when they went into that school. So they were told their culture was depraved. They condemned the hula and chant, which was the folk songs and did the transmission of the cultural values and the genealogy and everything else. That was totally condemned. And they were tried to turn them into Westerners using shame and punishment. It didn't work, but the oldest boy fought until they almost escaped to Tahiti. They had chartered a boat, and the 3 boys who were to become kings of Hawaii almost went off on this steamer, but they got caught. And then the oldest boy who had led this rebellion was expelled and died about 2 years later. I think he lost his will to meaning because he had lost everything. He had been disinherited. He was going to be the governor of Kauai. But you know, to me, that boy is a tremendous role model because he tried to hang on to some of his cultural values, whatever they were. And I think to Hawaiian people that we can find historical people like that boy. And I see the same thing is happening with Louis Riel, with the Métis back in Manitoba. They're starting to see the story from the indigenous perspective rather than the colonizers who took the land. So what we've got in these communities, and I think you can find them all over the place, people who are more familiar with the history, is you have tremendous role models of resiliency. There's, I think, tremendous lessons for the dominant culture in that maybe our systems are not the best the way that we think they are. So, you know, the 3 platforms that we have in Western civilization are basically Christianity, democracy, and capitalism. But I think we need to emphasize more with capitalism. We need social responsibility because you've still got things going on like in New Guinea where the resources are just being extracted and the people are being slaughtered. And it is American interests, mining interests. And even now we've got multinational corporations with these same mentalities to just get everything and to heck with the people who legitimately own that land. I got to tell you the other day, I had this strange experience. I was sitting at a dinner party, and this gentleman who I've known for many years is a writing colleague, and he started to talk about primitive people. As soon as he said primitive, I reacted, and I shouldn't have reacted. I'm usually able to stay calm under these circumstances. And then he said, you know, down in New Guinea, and immediately. And he said, I was talking to someone the other day, and there's these primitive people, and they've just made a mess out of all their government. And what he had done, he'd gotten Papua New Guinea mixed up with New Guinea. And I shouldn't have done it, but I corrected him. And I gave him a little lecture on, you know, there's 2 countries here. This happened to that one. And those people really weren't primitive. You know, the ones in New Guinea, they'd been there for 10,000 years. And they weren't contacted by white people until a cargo plane crashed there in 1938. And then after that, but they had a pretty good civilization going. They did have the odd war, but they had these towers, so they had a system where they would watch out. And it was sort of holding it in check, sort of like mutual assured destruction used to do with Russia and the United States, you know. So everybody was eating. They had agriculture perfected so that they had water irrigation systems, and they had enough food for everybody. They raised pigs. They had a lot of pigs. Their folk dances, they have birds of paradise down there, and they could do a folk dance. You would swear that was a bird of paradise. So they had more contact with nature, of course, and they had more understanding of nature. So when he said primitive, and I corrected him, he finally told me. I interrupted him twice, and I know I shouldn't have done it, and I was probably lecturing him, you know, like a grade 1 teacher or something. He finally told me, "You shut up," he said. You know, and I've never seen a porch cleared so fast. All the ladies went out into the kitchen, and all of a sudden the dinner got cooked very quickly. But this, I think, just goes to show you that, that there's a lot of assumptions that we make about primitive people who really aren't that primitive. And I often wonder when we're dropping bombs on people and going into other people's countries and things like that, if it's us who's the real primitives, you know. I know we do our best, but we wonder about that. What I think that needs to be done, this is it's like family therapy in Hawaii. It's called ho'oponopono, but it means to make right. So that we need to do a number of things with these situations. I think that we need to start dialoguing between the descendants of Aboriginal populations in whatever country they're in, and descendants of colonizers. Because most of the descendants of the colonizers don't really have an awareness of what the history was really like and what the history really did. I was shocked when I was at a conference in Vancouver Island that a lot of the native people are really angry at us, and I understand exactly why they are, but they kind of have written us off. And sometimes even when we try and help, they say, well, you shouldn't even be talking about this, how could you possibly understand this because you haven't gone through it? But we can try. But we really need to start dialoguing. We need to do something about these treaties. We need to, in the countries where they've never been done, and here in British Columbia it is happening. Hopefully they are going to get some good settlements. Hopefully they'll be like the people in Alaska who have actually benefited from these settlements. But in Australia, for instance, and I haven't gone into the history of Australia, it's really brutal. It was, again, back in 1795 where they decided to establish penal colonies in Australia. And they went in, they never did try to establish any kind of friendship with the Aboriginal people. They just started shooting them. So they've had a whole history where the Aboriginal populations were poisoned. They were invited for dinner or whatever, and then they would poison them. They had people on horseback, revolving squads using repeater rifles. They just shoot them on sight. They've wound up in places like the Maralinga Desert, which then they exploded an atomic device. They were testing nuclear atomic devices in They didn't warn the Aboriginal people. This was Britain. And they didn't even bother to warn the Aboriginal people in the Maralinga Desert that they were going to detonate an atomic bomb. So what you've got in Australia, the Prime Minister of Australia will not say he's sorry. They took the survivors of the Aboriginal populations down there, put them in what were really prison camps, and they taught them, they took them right away, separated the parents from the children. I don't know if you've seen a film called Rabbit Proof Fence, but if you ever get a chance to see Rabbit Proof Fence, it tells the story of one of those institutions. And they really were that bad. They really were doing eugenics. They would train these women as domestics, and when they then sent them out into their employers, they would get a lot of sexual predation. They would get pregnant. They would send them back to Moore River. They would choose the children with lighter skins. There was a place called Sister Kate's School, took these children with lighter skins. They were never told they were Aboriginal. They were trying to sneak them in with white skins into the domestic categories in Australia in the cities. So you had that one on for about 20 years, up until about 1946 even, where they weren't even told they were Aborigines. They'd eventually figure it out somewhere along the line, and then they would be terribly ashamed of their own background. So Australia is one of the worst places where the Prime Minister will not apologize. They have done very, very few treaties, and any treaties that they have done down there have been with worthless land, essentially. The one great thing here in British Columbia, I think, is there has been some cultural resurgence, so that you've had these canoe societies being formed again. And it was 1993, you had a terrific canoe journey all the way from Washington that went all the way up from Bella Bella and was joined by all kinds of other canoes from various areas, including Washington and all over British Columbia, and they had a huge gathering. And I think that that cultural resurgence is one of the greatest things that happened. It happened in Hawaii in 1970, where, with the it came out about all the discrimination in the United States, and the Hawaiians began to realize that they too had been discriminated against, and that's when they revived the hula and the chant, to the point now where you can go to the Merry Monarch Festival in Hilo in April if you ever want to see the authentic Hawaiian hula and chant, and they have hula competitions. It's like the World Championships in hula competitions. And finally, you're getting immersion Hawaiian schools. And again, the Hawaiian language was almost dead. There was only a few families that could still speak it, so it's come back to some extent. And the history that happened there is finally being told a little bit. No, what are we done? We're at 3:10, so we have 5 minutes. Yes, questions?
Well, actually, I don't know if you read just this year that in Hawaii, on Oahu, they did sign a treaty with the Hawaiians there and gave them back some property. Again, it's off in a corner somewhere, but it's more than
It's
they've ever
what they
done
did.
before.
A lady named Anna Rice was raising these issues, so they formed the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. In 1922, an interesting thing too, Prince Kuhio was the delegate to Congress, and he was actually a native Hawaiian. And they formed the Hawaiian Homeland. So what they did, this is an awful story, I can tell you. They took the worthless land on the slopes of Haleakala, the land on Molokai that didn't have water. It was third-rate grazing land. They put those into so-called homesteads for Hawaiians. At the same time they changed that act, they took 26,000 acres of the best agricultural land that was leased to plantations. They took it out of the stipulation that if there were 25 or more Hawaiians, they could homestead it. Took all that land out, left it in perpetuity to the white people who owned the land. And as a matter of fact, those are the lands, now that they've stopped pineapple production, that are being sold for luxury resorts and very, very expensive residential residences. So every time they get a tremendous movement saying we want something done, they'll make something like that.
That's what they did. They just gave them a small section.
Yeah, then they'll be quiet. They'll be quiet for a while. They were trying to pass the Akaka bill. It just failed a month ago. That would have given them the same rights as Native Americans. But all these people jumped up and said, "You're giving these people special privileges," and that was defeated in the Senate. So that's dead now.
Have there been studies that you know of any native populations that closely study those who don't become addicted? I mean, actually, the real question is,
I think
given
that.
everything, how did some
How
people
did they
make it
not?
through, right?
How did they make it through? Yeah, there probably are. Is Kimberly here? No, she's not here. She's from Alabama, but she's studying in Colorado, and she was telling me there are a lot of studies being done at the university that she's doing her Ph.D. at, and what they're trying to do is figure out how they can help. But they're looking for people who are in indigenous populations who are already saying we've got to do something about this. So what they're looking is like with addiction is a pre-contemplative stage where they really are trying to do something about it, and then they will go in, and they do have some things that will help. So if anybody sees Kimberly Miller, she's here at this conference, she can give you the names of the studies that they've actually done down there.
She is young woman, by the way.
But other than that, I think the Viktor Frankl, where you're going to try and get at the meaning of the suffering, and there is meaning. There's meaning for the descendants of the indigenous populations, that they have survived, that there's this tremendous resilience, that there is this strength within these communities, that they've made it through all this. I don't know how. I mean, if I was an Aborigine in Australia, I was just listening to the statistics about teenage suicide in Hong Kong, which is very bad. And I think that's being caused by all this academic pressure that's being put on, with no understanding that there's a normal curve of intelligence, and there's 28% of people who really, when you force them to do the curriculum at those rates, they can't do it. So either they have to, it's like high jumping. You've got to go up 8 feet and you can only do 4, and we're forcing a lot of our school populations. We presume that everybody can somehow manage the curriculum. But, if you just look at the normal curve of intelligence, there's below average people, which is up to 28% of our population, are going to have trouble with those curriculum designs, particularly at the high school levels and college levels. So it's not just a matter of persevering, and it's a matter of you need a certain level, particularly now with all the technology stuff. Any other questions? And I invite people. I don't have all the answers. And unfortunately, I've just looked at what occurred, which is kind of depressing, and I've been trying to write novels that at least get that awareness across as what go on, because I find that people in British Columbia, particularly the ones I come in contact with, really have no idea of the extent of the suffering that First Nations people have gone through here. And therefore, they're not very accepting of things like treaties being done. And if they only were aware. So The latest book I've written is one called Return of the Canoe Societies that actually does have the history of their attempts to get land claims since 1854. So I put a second edition of that one out because these land claims are going through, thinking that maybe if people read them, they would at least understand why we should be doing these treaties. Any other questions? Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.